My name is Robert Bob Mitchell, and I serve as a sergeant in the 1st Infantry Brigade during the Vietnam War back in 1967. I was just 20 years old when I got sent over to Vietnam. A small-town guy from Illinois, and like many others, I didn't know what to expect. I signed up for the Army because I thought it was the right thing to do. Looking back now, it's hard to explain why I wasn't scared at first. Maybe I was too young or just naive. Or maybe, like everyone else, I thought the war would be over before it even started. But the moment we touched down in Vietnam, everything changed. The heat, the humidity, it hit you like a wall. I was still getting used to my gear, the M16 rifle that felt heavier with every step, and the boots that rubbed my feet raw. The air always smelled of something burning or decaying, and the jungle was endless. I remember thinking to myself, what have I gotten into? We were stationed in the Central Highlands, around a place called Contum. We didn't know it at the time, but the area was a hotbed for Viet Cong activity. It wasn't just the battles we had to worry about. It was the constant threat of ambushes, hidden traps, and the knowledge that the enemy was all around us, invisible, watching us from the thick jungle. In Vietnam, you couldn't trust anything. The first couple of weeks were mostly training and getting used to the terrain. But then, they sent us out on patrols. Those first few patrols were the toughest. The fear was something you could taste in the air, something that wrapped around your throat and squeezed every time you heard a rustle in the brush. You didn't know if it was a friendly troop or a sniper waiting to take a shot. Every step felt like it could be your last. We were always on edge, and I remember one day, we got a tip from a local Vietnamese man that there was a Viet Cong outpost not far from where we were. It wasn't much, just a whisper in the wind, but it was enough to send us out on another search. The jungle was dense, with thick vines and trees that reached high into the sky. The humidity was so thick, you could barely see your hand in front of your face, and the only sound was the occasional call of a bird or the crunch of leaves beneath your boots. I was leading a small squad of men that day, 4 of us in total, including me. I don't remember the names of everyone. There were too many faces that blurred together in the madness. But there was Jimmy, who was fresh out of high school, barely 18. Then there was Jack, who had a thick southern accent and a laugh that could echo through the jungle. And then there was Frank, who was older than the rest of us. He was in his late 30s and had been through a lot more than we had. He'd seen combat in Korea before coming to Vietnam, and you could tell. He always had this calm about him, no matter what was going on around us. We set out that morning, moving through the jungle, trying to keep as quiet as we could. The sweat poured off our backs, but none of us complained. Complaints weren't welcome here. It was a silent understanding. You kept your head down, kept your eyes open, and kept moving forward. Hours passed and nothing happened. We kept our eyes peeled, moving cautiously through the dense undergrowth. The sun was high, and the heat was unbearable. My shirt stuck to my back, and the sweat in my eyes made it hard to see clearly. I was thankful for the dense foliage that provided some cover, but we all knew that it wasn't much protection. We knew the Viet Cong were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then it happened. We were walking along a narrow trail when the first shot rang out. It came from the trees on our left side, and it was so sudden, so unexpected, that we didn't know where to turn. The sound of the bullet cutting through the air was deafening, and the snap of the branches as it struck them made my heart skip a beat. My instinct was to drop to the ground, but I didn't want to make myself a target. I could hear Jimmy shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. My head was spinning. "Get down!" Frank shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. We hit the ground fast, and I could hear the crack of more gunfire. The Viet Cong were close, and they knew the jungle better than we did. We were sitting ducks in the open, with nothing to cover us but the jungle itself. I remember feeling the pressure build in my chest, like I couldn't breathe, like the weight of the situation was too much to handle. But Frank, he stayed calm. He didn't panic. He motioned for us to move. "Move to the left," he said, in a voice that was steady as ever. "Cover the open area. We can't stay here." I didn't have to be told twice. We scrambled to our feet and took off into the brush, moving as quickly and quietly as possible, trying to stay low to the ground. The gunfire continued, but we kept our heads down, staying behind whatever we could find. Trees, rocks, the thick underbrush. The battle that followed felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only minutes. But it was intense, and the fear was unbearable. There were more shots, more shouting, and then the silence. I don't know how we managed to get out of there alive, but we did. Frank led us through the jungle, keeping us low, moving when he said to move, and staying still when he said to stay still. I remember the adrenaline in my veins, the pounding of my heart, the fear that gripped me. But I also remember the relief when we finally got back to our camp. We were shaken, but we were alive. The days that followed were a blur. After the ambush, we stayed close to camp for a while, keeping our heads low and trying to shake off the adrenaline rush. The whole thing had left a mark on all of us. Even Frank, who always seemed unshakable, was quieter than usual. We were all trying to process what had just happened, how close we had come to losing it all. The enemy had been so close, and yet we had somehow gotten away. I think we all knew that luck had played a big part, but no one really talked about it. Out here, there wasn't time for talk. You just moved on to the next day. But things didn't stay quiet for long. About a week later, we were back out on patrol. Same routine. We moved at dawn, walked through the thick jungle, tried to stay as quiet as possible. But the unease was always there, like a shadow following us. The jungle felt different after that first encounter, more dangerous somehow, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I remember thinking to myself that if I kept looking over my shoulder, I would miss something important in front of me. So, I tried to focus. It was late in the afternoon when we made contact again. This time, it was an ambush of a different sort. We had just crossed a small river when we heard it, the low, unmistakable hum of a motor. My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly what it was. The Viet Cong used Soviet-made GZ-66 trucks to transport supplies and troops, and there was no mistaking the sound. "Get down," Frank hissed. We hit the ground without hesitation. I felt my stomach twist as we lay in the thick grass, trying to make ourselves invisible. The sound of the engine grew louder, and the tension in the air was suffocating. The engine roared, and soon, we could hear the clanging of metal. The truck had reached the riverbank, not far from where we were lying. I could feel my heart racing, my breath shallow. We weren't supposed to engage unless we had a clear advantage. But this time it was different. We were close, too close. "We're going to take it out," Frank said quietly. I wasn't sure if he was talking to us or just thinking out loud. But there was no time to argue. We knew the drill. "On three," Frank said. 1, 2, 3. I don't even remember aiming my rifle. Everything happened so fast. The moment Frank shouted, I just fired. The M16 kicked back against my shoulder, the shot echoing in the stillness of the jungle. I saw the truck's engine burst into flames almost immediately. It wasn't a direct hit, but the fuel line must have ruptured because the truck erupted in a cloud of smoke and fire. I could hear the screams of the enemy soldiers as they scrambled to get away from the burning vehicle. We didn't have time to celebrate, though. The sound of the gunfire had alerted more troops, and soon, we were under fire from the other side of the river. I remember seeing flashes of movement in the trees, the unmistakable shapes of Viet Cong soldiers, some with AK-47s, others moving into position with claymore mines. They had us pinned down. The gunfire was loud, deafening, really, and it seemed to come from every direction. I could hear the distinctive pop-pop-pop of the AK-47s, and I instinctively ducked behind a fallen log, trying to make myself as small as possible. The ground shook as rounds hit the earth around us. It felt like the world was collapsing in on me. "Stay low," Frank shouted. "Don't move unless I tell you." We were stuck pinned down by the enemy, and I could feel the weight of the moment. My hands were shaking, but I tried to stay calm. The rifle felt heavy in my hands, and my mind raced. I had been through a lot by then, but nothing like this. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud explosion followed by a crash. For a split second, I thought the ground was going to open up beneath me. The force of the blast threw dirt and rocks into the air, and I heard Jimmy scream. My heart jumped into my throat as I spun around to check on him. "Jimmy," I called, but my voice was drowned out by the ringing in my ears. He was lying flat on the ground, his arms stretched out in front of him, and for a second, I thought the worst. But when I crawled over to him, I saw he was still alive, barely. His face was pale, and he was covered in dirt and blood, but he was still breathing. I didn't know if it was shrapnel or if the blast had knocked the wind out of him, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered at that moment. "Jimmy," I said again, my voice cracking. "Stay with me, man." He opened his eyes, and for a second, he just stared at me. Then he blinked, and I could see the recognition in his face. He wasn't out of it completely, but the damage was done. The blast had left him shaken, and he was in no condition to keep moving. I wasn't sure what to do. We couldn't leave him behind, but we were still in the middle of a firefight. The Viet Cong were closing in. Frank seemed to sense the urgency, because he quickly motioned for me to help him get Jimmy to cover. "Help him, Mitchell," Frank ordered. "We need to move him." The adrenaline kicked in, and I didn't think twice. I grabbed Jimmy's arms, and with Frank's help, we dragged him into a small patch of dense brush that offered some cover. We had no choice but to hunker down and wait. Time seemed to slow down as we sat there, listening to the gunfire and the explosions. Every second felt like an eternity, but we couldn't risk making a run for it. We had to wait for the right moment, and when it came, it was quick. Frank shouted at us to move, and we made a break for it. I'll never forget the way my legs felt as we ran. Heavy, like they didn't want to cooperate. But we kept moving, and we made it back to our camp just as nightfall descended. We had lost men that day, men I would never forget. But we were alive. We had survived, and for that, we were grateful. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion, guilt, and disbelief. We made it back to base after that ambush, but it didn't feel like a victory. We had lost good men that day, men I had gotten to know, men I had fought alongside. Jimmy was lucky, but he was still messed up. The explosion had rattled him pretty badly, and though he could walk again, the psychological scars were deep. He wasn't the same after that day. None of us were. The days blended together in the swampy heat of Vietnam. Each patrol felt like a repetition of the last, as we moved through the jungle, waiting for another explosion, another firefight. We knew that if we stayed in the jungle too long, it was only a matter of time before we faced another ambush. It was just the way it worked over there. You never knew when the next danger would strike. One night, after a long day of walking, we set up camp near a small stream. We had just eaten our rations when Frank gathered us around the fire. "We're going to have to do another sweep tomorrow," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Word is, the Viet Cong have set up a new camp not far from here. We'll move out before dawn, hit them hard, and get back before the sun rises too high. We need to catch them off guard." The rest of us nodded. We didn't say much. We didn't have to. Everyone knew what needed to be done, but I could feel the weight of it all in my chest. It was hard to shake the feeling that we were just ticking time bombs waiting to go off. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds of the jungle, the rustling of leaves, the occasional animal cry, it all made me restless. But I tried to focus on the task ahead. We had a mission, and we needed to carry it out. No one was going to do it for us. When morning came, we moved out before the first light broke through the trees. The jungle was alive, and it felt like the air was thick with the promise of something terrible. We were deep in enemy territory now, and the thought of it made my stomach turn. But I didn't say anything. We were soldiers, and this was what we were trained for. We moved in a tight formation, keeping our weapons ready. Frank was leading the way, as always. The rest of us kept our eyes peeled, watching every rustling leaf, every shadow in the trees. We moved silently, only speaking in hushed tones when necessary. We reached the Viet Cong camp by late morning. It was smaller than we expected, but it was well hidden, tucked away in a dense patch of jungle near a steep hill. We had the element of surprise, and Frank made it clear that we needed to take advantage of it. We quickly set up a perimeter, and Frank motioned for us to get ready. "On my mark," he said, his voice low. "Wait until you hear the signal." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we crouched, waiting. The air was thick, heavy with the humidity and the tension. My palms were sweaty, and my fingers felt numb as I gripped my M16. I was ready for anything. Then the signal came, a single shot fired in the air, sharp and clear. "Go!" Frank shouted. We all moved at once. It was chaos, a blur of movement and gunfire. The Viet Cong soldiers didn't know what hit them. They scrambled, some diving for cover, others firing blindly in our direction. But we had the upper hand. We hit them fast and hard, just like Frank had planned. I remember the rush of it all. The first few moments were a whirlwind, gunshots, the sound of bodies hitting the ground, the crack of branches as soldiers tried to move through the jungle. I fired my rifle instinctively, but I don't remember aiming. My whole body was shaking, and the adrenaline took over. All I could hear was the roar of my own heartbeat and the sound of the gunfire. And then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. The camp fell silent. I don't know how long it took, but when it was done, it was eerily quiet. We had wiped out most of the Viet Cong fighters in that camp, but the damage was done. The chaos, the violence, the death, it all felt like a bad dream. I looked around at my squad. We were all breathing hard, sweat running down our faces, dirt and blood splattered on our fatigues. We had done what we came to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. The cost of it, the lives lost, the men we had killed, it weighed on me. We didn't say much. Frank gave the order to head back to camp, and we started moving. It was only after we had put miles between us and the camp that we could finally breathe again. But even then, the feeling of what we had done didn't leave me. That night, as we sat around the fire, the mood was subdued. Frank said a few words, reminding us that what we had done was necessary, that we had made a difference. But I didn't feel that way. I just felt empty. I had lost part of myself that day, and I wasn't sure I'd ever get it back. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? The days after that raid were quieter, but the silence didn't feel like peace. We moved through the jungle, always on the lookout for anything that seemed out of place. The enemy had a way of blending into the surroundings, of becoming part of the landscape. It made every step we took feel like we were walking on eggshells. The memories of that fight still lingered, and I could tell that the others were feeling it too. Even Frank, who had been our steady leader, seemed a little off, like the weight of everything was starting to get to him. I remember one night, about a week later, when I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. The crackling sound of the fire seemed louder than ever, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of my thoughts pressing in on me. It wasn't just the deaths we had seen. It was the constant fear, the never-ending tension. Every day felt like we were just waiting for something terrible to happen. The thought of it made my stomach churn. "Bob," Frank's voice interrupted my thoughts. He was sitting a few feet away, sharpening his knife. "You all right?" I didn't know how to answer. I didn't feel all right. I don't think any of us did. But I couldn't just say that. So, I just nodded. "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. "Just tired, I guess." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded and kept sharpening his knife. Frank was a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. He was our leader, and in that moment, it felt like we were all trying to keep it together, even if none of us knew how. The next day, we got new orders, another patrol, another sweep of the area. It felt like the same routine, day after day. But something about that day was different. There was a tension in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something worse than what we had already faced. We moved out early in the morning, our gear heavy on our backs, and our eyes scanning the jungle with every step. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the dense foliage. We kept moving through the brush, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The jungle seemed alive with sounds, the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves, the faint hum of insects. But beneath it all, there was something else. It was like the jungle was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the first shot rang out. It wasn't a burst of gunfire like we were used to. It was a single shot, sharp and clear. I hit the ground without thinking. The others followed suit, and we quickly spread out, trying to find cover. The shot came from the far side of the trail, but we couldn't see anything. The jungle was too thick, and the only thing we could hear was the sound of our own breathing, fast and shallow. "Stay low," Frank whispered. "They're out there. Don't move until I give the word." We were frozen in place, all of us on edge, waiting. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, and my heart was racing. The sound of the shot had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. The fear that had been building up for weeks had finally bubbled to the surface, and I didn't know how to push it back down. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. It was the waiting that killed you out here. The not knowing when the next shot would come, when the next ambush would hit. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. Then, Frank motioned for us to move. "Get to that tree line," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll make our move from there." We moved quickly, staying low to the ground, making as little noise as possible. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel my muscles screaming as I crawled through the underbrush. Every twig that snapped beneath me made my heart race. When we reached the tree line, we stopped. I could hear the faint sound of voices in the distance, but they were too muffled to make out any words. We were close now. Too close. Frank gestured for me to take the lead. I wasn't sure I was ready for that, but I didn't have a choice. We all knew how it worked. The person in front was the first to get hit if things went south, but that's what we signed up for. We had to keep moving forward. As we neared the clearing where we thought the Viet Cong were hiding, I felt my stomach tighten. I was ready for anything at this point, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. We had just reached the edge of the clearing when suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the ground beneath us. The force of it knocked me off my feet, and I hit the ground hard, my head spinning. The blast was followed by the rapid crackle of AK-47 fire. It was an ambush, and this time, there was no mistaking it. I scrambled to my feet, my rifle raised, but everything was a blur. The jungle was alive with gunfire, and all I could do was react. I fired, but I couldn't see anything clearly. It was chaos. Men yelling, bullets flying through the air, the ground shaking from the impact of explosions. For a moment, I thought we were done for. The enemy was everywhere, and we were stuck in the open. But somehow, we managed to find cover behind a thick tree. Frank was shouting orders, trying to get us organized, but it all felt like too much. And then, just as I was about to lose it, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a figure moving in the distance. Just a silhouette at first, but then I saw him clearly. It was Jimmy. He had come back. Despite everything that had happened, despite the odds, Jimmy had shown up to fight with us. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw Jimmy. There he was, moving through the jungle like a ghost, his rifle raised, firing back at the Viet Cong. His face was hard to read. His usual easygoing grin was gone, replaced by a determined look that was both comforting and terrifying. He shouldn't have been out there, not after what happened to him. But there he was, right in the middle of the firefight, like he was never injured, like he hadn't been through hell himself. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. I saw Frank's face, his jaw clenched, as he processed the same thing I had. He didn't say anything, but I could tell what he was thinking. Jimmy's decision was reckless, but it also spoke volumes. He wasn't about to let the rest of us fight without him. I snapped back to the moment. The enemy was still pushing in, and we had no time to waste. Frank shouted for us to move, and we started firing in short bursts, trying to push the Viet Cong back. It wasn't easy. They knew the land better than we did, and they were everywhere, hiding behind trees, moving through the dense brush. But Jimmy was with us now, and it gave me a sense of hope I hadn't felt in weeks. His presence gave me something to hold on to, something to fight for. We kept up the fire for what felt like hours. The battle was chaotic, the smoke from the explosions swirling around us. I lost track of time, but eventually we managed to push the enemy back. The Viet Cong, realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned, began to retreat. The firefight slowed to a stop, but the tension remained in the air, thick and heavy. I looked over at Jimmy again. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but there was something about him in that moment, something in the way he held his rifle, his posture, his eyes, that reminded me of the man he used to be. The blast from that day, the shock of the ambush, hadn't broken him. In fact, it seemed to have made him stronger. We weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time in days, I felt like we had a chance. We weren't just surviving, we were fighting back. We were holding on to something that mattered. After the battle, we took stock of the situation. We had lost a few men, but we'd also managed to take out a significant portion of the Viet Cong forces in the area. It wasn't a total victory, but it was something. It was enough to give us a small sense of triumph. Jimmy wasn't the same man he had been before the explosion, but he was still here, still fighting with us. And that was enough. We made our way back to camp under the cover of darkness, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. We didn't talk much. The silence was comfortable in a way. We had all been through something, and sometimes words just didn't seem necessary. That night, as we sat around the fire again, I couldn't shake the feeling that this war was changing us, that we were losing parts of ourselves with every battle. But at the same time, there was something unbreakable about us, something that couldn't be shattered by gunfire or explosions. Maybe it was the bond we shared, the fact that we were all in this together. Or maybe it was just the will to survive, to keep going even when it seemed impossible. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. None of us were giving up. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. We weren't just soldiers anymore. We were brothers.